Hello, this is going to be a quick book review of Diamond's Pulitzer Prize winner, Germs and Steel. This is a compilation of criticisms that I personally have found and discovered. These are not criticisms that I found in articles and book reviews on the web. So these are my personal criticisms of Diamond's book. I will admit that I could have done a more complete compilation of criticisms by going through these reviews recently, writing the criticisms down and making a complete and full compilation of criticisms, anomalies, and logical flaws of the Diamonds in regards to this book. But I decided to be a little bit lazy, I must admit, and so I'm just going to introduce my own criticisms. Alright. Well, there's no need, I think, to explain Jared Diamond's thesis and, I guess, theory. If you are familiar with the book, you're probably already familiar with what his theory is, so no need for me to go into all of that. Now, the first thing I want to do is just to mention that I'm a bit surprised over the non-reaction towards what Jared Diamond has to say in his book on page 21. It's pretty early in the book, and I haven't seen any reaction towards this, so I'm a bit shocked. You see, this book is sort of trying to argue against the idea that heritability or genes or nature has had any sort of role, vital role, in the advancement of cultures and the creations of civilizations, advanced civilizations. So it's very much geared and directed towards white people, although he speaks about Eurasia, it sort of is directed towards white people and or Europeans. But on page 21 of his book, in Guns, Germs and Steel, Mr. Diamond states that, quote, in mental ability, New Guineans are probably genetically superior to Westerners, close quote. I mean, why there's not an outcry in regards to this, why no one is pointing out his hypocrisy, is astonishing to me. I mean, here we have a guy trying to dismantle the idea that genes have anything to do with intelligence and culture, yet we can say this about Westerners, that in quote, in mental ability, New Guineans are probably genetically superior to Westerners, close quote. Just mind-blowing. That out of the way, let's go to the criticisms here that I have compiled. Alright. Sub-Saharan Africa was in greater contact with the Islamic world than Western Europe. Much of Sub-Saharan Africa is still Islamic, even today. That's my first criticisms. 2. We have archaeological evidence that proves even Southern Africa was in contact with the Arabs, Persians, and Chinese. Refined manufactured goods have been found there. Once again, according to Diamond, these people are so backwards because of their alleged isolation. The truth is that the Arabs were more familiar with Sanye than they were with, say, Scandinavia. My third criticism is that Ethiopia and Somalia had far more extensive contact with the Egyptians and their neighbors than Western Europe. My fourth criticism is that Sub-Saharan Africa was less isolated from the rest of the world than Western Europe in the Middle Ages. By Jared Diamond's reasoning, the former should have went on to dominate the world, not the latter. Alright, Sub-Saharan Africa was less isolated from the rest of the world than Western Europe in the Middle Ages. So according to Jared Diamond's reasoning, the former should have went on to dominate the world, not the latter. My fifth criticism is this, and this is extremely problematic for Diamond's thesis, or theory. As a matter of fact, Sub-Saharan Africa was more in contact with the Islamic world than Western Europe in spite of the Sahara. Islam left an indelible mark on the region that persists in modern times. It's true that several kingdoms did arise to service the Arabs with golden slaves, but I was under the impression that this relationship of dependence is what had retarded the region. It seems that left-wingers and Jared Diamond can't make up their minds. My sixth criticism is this. The Mongols and Huns, the Mongols and Huns are a poignant illustration of how geography and biodiversity are not the determinants of history that Jared Diamond claims they are. These nomadic steppe tribes were ideally situated along the so-called Eurasian axis to develop into a formidable civilization, but nothing of the sort ever occurred. My seventh criticism, I believe, the American Indians really were isolated from the old world, but still managed to build far more impressive civilizations than, say, Sub-Saharan Africans. In fact, this is one of the strongest arguments I know of that their situation is not attributable to their environmental circumstances. Sub-Saharan Africans were deficient relative to Western Europeans in science and technology, not in population size. This ultimately owes little to either geography or food crops. Indeed, the region suffers from no such isolation today, but is now more backwards than ever before, despite having the advantage by being in contact with Europeans, taking a technological leap from the Bronze Age to the Industrial Age several hundred years ago. And this failure seems largely due to their own ingenuity when juxtaposed next to the far more impressive accomplishments of the American Indians. My eighth criticism, I believe, is that African kingdoms arose to sell natural resources, gold and slaves, to the Persians, Arabs, and Chinese in exchange for sophisticated manufactured goods. How is this any different from countries like Nigeria, Angola, or Congo today? It doesn't mean they had any real intellectual achievements of their own to boast about, unlike the European, Chinese, or American Indians. My ninth criticism is this. Obviously, the existence of cities in the region hasn't led to any spectacular sub-Saharan contributions in science and technology as Jared Diamond's thesis would predict. If a thesis is unable to predict, then it's a flawed thesis. Diamond's thesis is flawed. Alright, so that was my last point in regards to that. Now I would like to go on to my other arguments in regards to domesticated animals. And again, I could have compiled more criticisms in regards to domesticated animals, both logical criticisms in regards to his logic of how he defines a domesticated animal. I've seen excellent criticisms created by other people that has reviewed Jared Diamond's book, but I must admit I'm lazy. I'm not gonna incorporate their argument in this compilation here. These are my criticisms that I came up with a year ago or something. I just want to make a shorter version of my criticisms. Alright, so my first argument here is turn to page 167 of Guns, Germs and Steel. Now, according to Jared Diamond, sheep and goats were domesticated in Southwest Asia, the horse in Ukraine, the cow in Southwest Asia, India, and North Africa, and the pig in China. The chicken came from Southeast Asia, and these animals were introduced into both Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the species that were domesticated were native to the Middle East and Asia and were introduced to Europe from there. Of course, by his reasoning, the Middle East and China should be light years ahead of the West in science and technology today, and they are not, clearly. My second argument is this. This does enormous damage to his argument. First, the American Indians lacked pigs, sheep, goats, cows, horses, and chickens, yet still managed to build impressive civilizations. Second, the American Indians were completely isolated from the old world, unlike Sub-Saharan Africans. Third, Sub-Saharan Africans had access both to the domesticated animals and technology of the old world. So that's my criticism of that. Moving on. My first criticism here is in regards to horses. How should I put this? He emphasized the importance of horses, right? So this is the criticism of this from me personally. 1. The Afro-Islamic states actively traded gold for horses. Sub-Saharan blacks were herding cattle as far south as Namibia when the Portuguese first arrived there. The Congolese had plenty of cattle. Sub-Saharan Africans were in the possession of such animals. They had both cattle and horses when Europeans arrived there in the 15th century. Herding was an important part of many African cultures, as it had been for millennia amongst Germanics in Northern Europe. The cannibals of the Congo even had cattle themselves. The Bantu, who pushed back the forest pygmies and Hottentots, were also herders. Alright, so yeah, that's an anomaly. That puts a hole in his theory, I would say. My second argument is this. Keep in mind that Native Americans were able to build impressive civilizations without any of these animals and with virtually no contact with Eurasia, unlike Sub-Saharan Africa. My third point is this. The horse was domesticated in Central Asia. By his reasoning, the inhabitants of this region should have left behind impressive civilizations because of their privileged access to this technology for thousands of years, unlike, say, the Egyptians. Of course, the most famous expert users of these animals, the Huns and Mongols, were nomad raiders who left behind no civilization of their own. So much for the horse determining civilization. My fourth point is this. Yet for over 500 years before the colonial period, West Africans used horses in large numbers. See the link below. Fifth point is this. Horses were known in West Africa centuries before the Middle Ages. West Africans simply made little use of them because of the lack of technology. See the link. The camel-based trans-Sahara trade had been going on since the time of the Carthaginians, who introduced iron working into the region. So that's my criticism of that. Next is, I guess, crops and food production. My first criticism here is this. In Africa, a biography of the continent, a large-scale agricultural survey, found that 20% of Africa's land to be suitable for agricultural development. I don't think you realize that 20% of Africa's land being suitable for agricultural development, that is an enormous amount of land when you consider the size of Sub-Saharan Africa relative to Europe. Please see the images that will follow after this as a geography size-by-size comparison. Anyway, Sub-Saharan Africa had a population comparable to that of Europe at the time of contact. So the argument that the sub-Saharan diet suffered from incredible deficiencies is ludicrous. We can dispense with all this talk about food crops because sub-Saharan Africa had a population comparable to that of Western Europe in the 15th century. Sub-Saharan Africa was not a sparsely inhabited region like, say, the Canadian Arctic or Siberia. Indeed, the climate of Africa was so poor that the region was sporting such a large population in spite of the vastly inferior technology of indigenous Africans. Wrap your head around that one. My second argument is this. Europe is broken off by mountain ranges, and much of Scandinavia is unsuited for agriculture. It's a very rocky landscape. Furthermore, the thick soil of Northern Europe was difficult to cultivate until the advent of the heavy plough and climatic changes during the early Middle Ages. So that put off a sufficient food production. So it's not as if Europe has had an optimal climate themselves in regards to this. And here we'll be following a geography size-by-size comparison so that you realize just how enormous 20% of Africa is. And here's a proportion of forests from total land area and how the physical landscape of Europe looked like. Alright, so lastly here, sub-Saharan Africans were not isolated from the rest of the world like the American Indians. During the Middle Ages, they were in closer contact with the Islamic world than Western Europe was. Sub-Saharan Africans had cattle, horses, goats, and other livestock. They had their own diseases like malaria and yellow fever, which kept Europeans at bay until the 19th century. Their populations were not utterly decimated by European diseases like the American Indians were. The Sahara was not the barrier to the spread of technology that the Atlantic Ocean was. Their diet was in no way deficient relative to Europeans and allowed them to sustain large populations. The Chinese had a 1,000-year head start in civilization over Northern Europe. The Arabs and Chinese had enormous cities in the Middle Ages. And in the New World, Tenochtitlan was bigger than any contemporary city in Western Europe, despite having no contact with Eurasia or none of the livestock, and no horses, and did not have this y-axis advance privilege, if you will, that Diamond claims that is so important for the advancement of civilization. Well, again, let's refer back to the Mongoloids and the Huns' lack of a advanced civilization. And if you've ever seen the Silk Road, it runs through vastly different geographies. It's run through the desert. It runs through mountain ranges. It runs through forested areas. It's a very diverse area anyway. So it's really odd arguments that some of Diamond's arguments are really odd. Lastly, I could also, I guess, I remember one argument that I did not come up with myself, but that I saw, that I think, just to give you an example of that there are actually good arguments there and anomalous to his theory, that puts a hole in his theory. How much so is subjective, that depends on the interpreter, but Diamond has argued that, well, Europeans has been able to create great civilizations in Argentina and such because it's in the same hemisphere as Europe is. And and this person critiquing Jared Diamond, he mentioned Costa Rica. Well, how about the civilization that Europeans created in Costa Rica? Jared Diamond would probably say something, well, but by that time they already had the inventions necessary to create a civilization, and so on and forth and so on. So anyway, yeah, you can debate this back and forth. Now, I'm not going to go into human biodiversity and the biological differences between human populations and races. I don't need to do that in this video. This video is just mentioning a couple of anomalies of Jared Diamond's work, which I would say put a hole in his theory, or thesis, whatever you want to call it. There's a couple of reviews that I would recommend you to look up. One is Steve Saylor's, another one is Michael Levin's, another one is J.P.Rushton. He actually, I believe, have two book reviews full of criticisms of Mr. Jared Diamond. There's also two books that I would recommend, in particular one by a Mr. Michael H Hart that is called Understanding Human History. That book is actually a response to Mr. Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs and Steel, where he tries to add another dimension to explain the way that human history unfolded. Whereas Jared Diamond makes himself more handicapped and retards himself and limits himself by neglecting and excluding the possibility that genes might have also played a role. Michael H. Hart incorporates that dimension and thus provides a much fuller picture of how things might be and how and why things turned out the way they did. So I would definitely recommend reading Michael H. Hart's book, Understanding Human History. Also read Richard Lynn's Race Differences in Intelligence. In it, I believe it's that book, but I'm not sure. The last thing I would like to say is this. Jared Diamond could be argued to be a complete environmental determinist, but I am not going to make that argument. He does, however, emphasize the importance of environment to an almost exaggerated, if not an exaggerated extent. However, if environment can have such a profound impact on an individual or population's outcomes, then why is this prediction not met in reality in our contemporary society in regards to adopted blacks, whites, and Asians, for an example? If environment can have such a profound effect on how well an individual or population does, then why are blacks adopted into white households only scoring a few IQ points above the black average, well below the white average? And why are Northeast Asians adopted into white households scoring a few IQ points above the white average, almost identical or close to the Northeast Asian IQ average from which they come? Are adopted black children and babies bringing with them into white households a poor culture that negate or nullifies the more optimal cultural admixture of white households? Or could this in part be explained by genetics? Are adopted Northeast Asian children and babies bringing with them into white Western households a more optimal culture that enables them to score higher on an IQ test than their white friends and family? Or could this again in part be explained by genetics? What is most likely? Occam's razor. Or could it simply be that the most easiest answer explains the IQ disparity between different human populations or races? Environment matter, but so does genes. Could this be the case? It's not that babies bring with them a culture. Babies do not bring with them cultures, but they bring with them genes and different genetic potentials, which environments either can aid or hinder. Environments can either enable an individual or a population to achieve their genetic potential or not. Alright? Adopted blacks score the lowest on average. Northeast Asians score the highest on average, and adopted whites score around the white average. This is the empirical fact. This seems to contradict J. Diamond's thesis. Or are you going to argue that all human populations and races are precisely the same, precisely equal on average, and that epigenetic effects has had such a huge impact before the arrival of these transracially adopted children as to create a disadvantage for black babies, hindering black babies to reach an existing genetic potential in white households that is actualized and obtained by whites and Asians? However, how do you then explain that adopted Northeast Asians outperform adopted whites? Are whites too hindered by detrimental epigenetic effects that hinders them to reach their existing genetic potential, which is exactly as high as Northeast Asians? You would have to. Or otherwise you're saying that Northeast Asians have a higher IQ than whites, at least. It is just that whites are not as epigenetically hindered as blacks are, perhaps. How come North Koreans and South Koreans score the same IQ, around 105 and 106, despite growing up in vastly different environments, North Korea being far more epigenetically detrimental, poor, and repressive? And if Diamond is correct that cultural admixture, cultural influence, can have such a profound impact on an individual or population, population's societal success and their personal and social outcome, then why do we see blacks born into the upper class scoring lower than whites born into the lower class? This goes against Mr. Diamond's thesis or theory. I think to call something that does not predict real-world outcomes, it does not deserve to be called a theory, so I am reluctant to call Mr. Diamond's thesis a theory. I think it deserves to be called a thesis at this point, and I do not see how this can be a required book to read in certain university classes in contemporary modern society. It contains a lot of misinformation, and at the very least it should come with a warning label, or else lazy thinkers might cling on to this book as a defense of their naive worldview, relying on it to do their arguing, when it retards personal growth, slows down a collective educational maturing rate in our society in regards to how the world likely operates. Rather than individuals going out and searching this question on their own, they cling to this book, this very misinformed book. I mentioned earlier that we see blacks born into the upper class scoring lower than whites born into the lower class. Frey and Detterman, 2004, reported a correlation of 0.82 between G, General Intelligence Factor, and SAT scores. There is a correlation between IQ scores and SAT scores of about 0.82. I mentioned this to bring up this point. Whites from families of incomes below $10,000 had a mean SAT score that was 61 points higher than blacks whose families had an income of $80,000 to $100,000. If environment predicts that whites ought to do worse than these blacks, then why don't they? Why do we see this cross-cultural international phenomenon if environment plays such a significant role and genes play such a minuscule role? Why do we see this cross-culturally? Why do we see this internationally? Why does this not go away when we change the environment? I think lying to oneself and about the truths of the world by willfully not incorporating the possibility that human biodiversity exists and in part explains the world, it only prolongs the inevitable, and in the meantime will cause more confusion, needless social experimenting, and social harm than to be scientific about this and allowing oneself another dimension of examination when analyzing society, namely the biological lens. To cripple oneself by not adopting this biological lens from which to analyze society from you're never going to make sense of the world, regardless of how big or how little of a role biology may or may not play. This was my shorter review of Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs and Steel. I think the fact that it was a Pulitzer Prize winner says more about the willful ignorance of our political climate and the corruption and fear of the intellectual elite than the actual quality of the book itself. I could have incorporated more arguments from other reviewers in this compilation of criticisms directed against the book, but as stated in the beginning, in this department I was simply lazy and therefore chose to merely use my own personal criticisms. It was a while ago since I read the reviews, the critique of Jared Diamond's book, so I do not remember those exact arguments, and that's why I chose not to incorporate it in this compilation. In other words, there are more and better criticisms out there to be read for sure, and I would advise you to read them to better equip yourself, in order to better equip yourself with knowledge to combat the contemporary ignorance that in part is spread by books such as Guns, Germs and Steel.